But then you have the other side of the, in order to demonstrate the other side, I moved to a different location. But then you have the other side of the angry Twitter responders who will say, having Morgan Freeman in Unforgiven, I mean, the Twitter didn't exist at the time, but having Morgan Freeman in Unforgiven is forced diversity, and that's, that ruins movies. There are plenty of black cowboys, but they'll, the first response is that they just dislike the diversity, certainly born from racism, but also born from this nostalgic image of the Western as being this paragon of toxic masculinity, or paragon of masculinity, of paragon of whiteness and what have you. But the post-rationalization, I've talked about post-rationalizations plenty, but the post-rationalization is that forced diversity is bad or whatever. And so you can go back and forth on that sort of argument, and that's why I would say that's an ineffective measure of aesthetic value. Again, that's a different issue, separate from the actual aesthetic value of the text, just like biography is a separate issue. It's a valid issue, and it can affect your entirely subjective response to something, for sure. But I think I might end up with most of the animals in this episode. What do you think about that, Bo? There's not enough cats in Westerns. You'll have dogs every once in a while, but not enough cats. But it's an ineffective measure of aesthetic value, I would say, and it's an entirely valid issue to talk about. Diversity in a story, but it's hard to turn that into something to measure just the aesthetic value of a text based solely on that, other than it affecting your visceral response to something. And if that were the measure, and this is one of the interesting things about that as a comparison, if that were a measure, Wild Wild West probably would win, because it does have Will Smith as the main character. It has Salma Hayek as the main female character. Gender diversity is never really something that has ever been prominent in Westerns necessarily, and that's another one of those things where you'll have the post-rationalization of historical accuracy being lobbed against a movie that includes a lot of female actors in a Western or what have you. And usually the female characters are, prostitutes or whatever. And that's, certainly Unforgiven. Are there interesting female characters? Sure. If you look at Jodie Foster in Maverick, if you look at Salma Hayek in Wild Wild West, and in Dead Man, there's really only a prostitute. That tends to be that tends to be the type of character that shows up in Western. But if you look at Jodie Foster and Salma Hayek, there's some sort of tough characters who come off as they're both really lighthearted and wacky sort of movies anyway. But they're the Jodie Foster and Salma Hayek are both these kind of tough characters who sort of portray themselves as weak in order to advance in society and what have you. So arguably the two weakest movies are at least trying something. It's again, all of these, it's awkward and heavy-handed, and arguably all four of them fail in terms of actually effectively fairly handling diversity without any sort of awkwardness, as I'm demonstrating now. It is an awkward thing to talk about, but actually handling it really effectively. All four of them failed miserably, arguably. But at least Maverick and Wild Wild West are trying to have a character who is a female character who is somewhat of a tough character. The whole plot of Unforgiven is these women are assaulted, and they hire Clint Eastwood's character as an assassin to kill their assaulters. So there's a lot of, I would say the aesthetic issue is more the tropiness of Unforgiven. It's the most critically acclaimed of the four, exponentially more critically acclaimed than any of the other ones. Yet it's arguably the most tropey. So in terms of originality, here's another interesting point. Unforgiven is very tropey, fails on originality, in that it's kind of just a retelling of Shane. But if you look at Wild Wild West, if you judge it just purely based on visceral response, I mean, Unforgiven is very good at eliciting visceral response. There's a lot of really intense scenes, and it's really, lots of great acting and everything like that. In terms of storytelling, it's very tropey. It's not very original. Wild Wild West is an interesting one to look at because it is a remake of a TV show. Maverick is also a remake of a TV show. Dead Man probably is the most original in the sense that it's hard to even call it just a genuine Western because it has this very weak main character who's dying for most of the movie, and he has this. I mean, that arguably I would say all of them fail because they're all heavy-handed and awkward, but arguably that one deals with the Native American issue most favorably. Because the Native American character that Johnny Depp's character, William Blake, Johnny Depp's character, interacts with is trying to guide him to the other side, guide him through death, that sort of thing. So not as reliant on cliches. It's definitely not a white savior sort of trope, the way Dances with Wolves is. Because nobody's being saved. But Wild Wild West is an interesting one in terms of originality because the show it's based on, I would say, it's a show that I used to love. Very odd sort of a show. It arguably is the origin of steampunk. I think it would have been a forgotten show completely. I used to love the show. I used to watch it during the afternoon. I wouldn't watch any other Western show, but I used to watch that in the afternoons on like TBS or something. But it was a Western show, and it had all these weird steam-powered technologies and gadgets and things like that. That was not a thing when the TV show came out. So anytime you look at steampunk, which is, Westerns are very narrow sort of content-based genre. Steampunk is an even more narrow content-based genre. But anytime you talk about the history of steampunk, you have to mention the Wild Wild West TV show. So in terms of originality and uniqueness, certainly Dead Man would win on that measure in the sense that, how it treats the sort of surreal imagery of the West, and Jim Jarmusch's directing turns everything very dreamlike. So on this level of surrealism, that one probably wins. But the integration of quirky steam-powered technology, comparing just Wild Wild West to Maverick and Unforgiven, in terms of originality, arguably that wins. Both Unforgiven and Maverick are very tropey. They rely very heavily on traditional story beats of Westerns. Then there's the giant spider, and I love the giant mechanical spider. It's become notorious because of Kevin Smith's epic story of being encouraged to include a giant spider in his Spider-Man screenplay. And, his epic story ends with, I went to see Wild Wild West, and how does it end? This giant mechanical spider. So on one measure, that's campy and over the top and bizarre and understandable why it might get 17% on Rotten Tomatoes. But in terms of just pure fun and delight and enjoyment, and just a basic measure of visceral stimulation, despite, a lot of technical level sort of things, traditional sort of measures of good and bad, you might, it's understandable to call that bad. But in terms of enjoyment, it's tons of fun. I mean, there's a giant mechanical spider. How can you not love that? And that's sort of the direct comparison that you might consider with like Birds and Birdemic. Birds, technically beautifully shot movie. All of the shot compositions are gorgeous. The ratcheting up of tension is expertly done. All that kind of stuff. But if you look at Birdemic is enjoyable. There's nothing really traditionally good at all about Birdemic. But if you watch it, it's really enjoyable to watch because of how bad it is and how random it is and how many, quote unquote bad, how random it is and how many shifting plot threads just sort of come out of nowhere and come up and get dropped. It's a roller coaster of strange unexpectedness. And so if you say, just in terms of enjoyable things to watch, things that you can rewatch over and over again, if I had to choose those four, I'd just throw on Wild Wild West and watch it just because it's just wacky and over the top and very enjoyable for a very, very different reason than Unforgiven is. But Maverick is not really one of those. Maverick is just kind of bland. It's fine. I think it's, right in the middle of critical esteem. It made, enough money, but it's just really forgettable. It's so tropey and everything's just kind of okay. But I think my Western video might be cursed, to never exist. Maybe I should take the hint and not actually finish it. But my main point is, you take a lot of modes of assessment, and usually if you're reading a story or something like that, your first response might be, this is good because blank, or this is bad because blank. And a lot of them don't really, a lot of those post-rationalizations don't really hold up. And I think the most potent example might be the idea of the trope, because just by the nature of a Western, they're very tropey. Is something being tropey necessarily mean it's bad? Well, it can be good. Unforgiven is well regarded. It's very tropey. Dead Man and Wild Wild West flip a lot of those tropes upside down and do really challenging things with it. Wild Wild West is considered a very bad movie. Dead Man is considered an unusual movie. So just having tropes is not necessarily a universal bad. And a lot of the supposed universal bads are not really bads. But does it transcend those tropes? Does Unforgiven do enough beyond the tropes to justify it as being a good movie? Yeah, arguably. It has intense moments that transcend the counter effects of stimulation that something being very tropey does. Does Maverick transcend those? No, not really. Arguably. So that's more like something that marks it as not side by side, not as good. So that being said, also, as something like Wild Wild West, if you look at Wild Wild West and Dead Man, this is the sort of pattern that I notice in creative writing workshops. Wild Wild West does bizarre things that are really, really unexpected of that type of movie. So the first response might be, it does these bizarre things because it's a bad movie. And that, I think that's what a lot of the critics said then, and they might still say today, who knows. But is that alone, does that make it a bad movie? It's still an enjoyable movie. But also look at Dead Man. Dead Man does a lot of really unusual things. Didn't get a lot of attention for it. Is your first response to say, these are not things you're supposed to do in a Western? That's sort of the opposite response to saying it's really tropey, is you could say, these are not things you're supposed to do in a Western. A Western is not supposed to have a giant mechanical spider. Is that universally a bad thing? Well, no, of course not. So, ultimately the measure is whether or not it's enjoyable. So, that being said, actually, the best 90s Westerns, if you ask me, are Young Guns 2 and Quigley Down Under, which I can watch over and over and over again. But those are ones that I think you have to be exactly I was 11 when those came out in 1990. I think you have to be maybe exactly my age to love those two movies as passionately as I do. But maybe they deserve their own videos. But they are masterpieces. Young Guns 2 and Crinkly Down Under are masterpieces. Alright, well, see you on the next episode. I finally finished this cursed episode. See you on the next episode, which hopefully is not as cursed. This might be my most thoroughly interrupted video. So I'll just wrap up. Forces beyond me are telling me I need to stop talking about Westerns. Randomly. So just to sum up, there's a lot of imprecise measures of aesthetic quality that people apply to stories, and looking at, you know, just this very narrow set of stories, I think demonstrates that in some interesting ways. So, you know, things like creator's biography or diversity or that sort of thing. Those are very, very important issues outside of the aesthetic value of the text, and they can affect the aesthetic value of the text when they do affect the visceral response to the text. But the visceral response functions much more as an effective measure, and it's more of a subjective measure too. So, you know, any sort of subjective visceral response is valid. And things like tropes, I mentioned tropes a lot, but the main point that I want to make with tropes is that you can hear you know, responses to text that say, this is bad because it's very tropey. And tropes might be a factor. Speaking of